interesting to say are Anne Morgan and Helen Vassallo. So what will be happening is that I'll give a brief introduction to them. They'll talk us through their projects, and then we'll have a kind of fairly fluid question answer session, I think, moving between the two of them. But what I would like to encourage people, that if you have any questions that you want to put to Helen and Anne, and I'm sure you'll all have numerous questions, I'm going to have to sort of try and stop myself from from overwhelming them with questions, because their projects are so marvelous and have been so influential, I think. But please do put your questions into chat whilst we're having the conversation, and I'll try and feed those questions in. And then if possible, if I see there's quite a range of questions that we weren't already thinking about talking about during the session, I will try and make sure there's time at the end for sort of a proper question answer session. But please do, please don't be afraid to sort of ask anything that comes into your head when you're listening to what I think will be a really, really interesting conversation. The session is going to be recorded, so do please bear that in mind. But don't be afraid to sort of chip in at any stage if you want to. And as I was saying, certainly for the first sort of 35 to 40 minutes, if you could feed questions via chat, that would be really helpful, and I'll try and make sure they get to Helen and Anne. What you'll see there that I've done as a preemptive measure, for any of you who don't know Anne Morgan and Helen Vassallo, is to put links to their blogs on their reading projects into chat. And I'll try and add in any other material as I go along, but I'm sure that each of you will all be responding and inspired by the conversation, and we'll add in additional references as we go along. So I'll make a start, given that it's now 2:02. And as I said, brief introduction to our two speakers today, and then we'll move into what I trust is going to be a really interesting and free-flowing conversation. So Anne Morgan and Helen Vassallo probably need no introduction, because in any forum where we find people talking about reading and translation, their projects have been so influential. Anne Morgan is the UK-based author, Royal Literary Fund Fellow and editor, best known for her influential project on reading world literature, A Year of Reading the World, and you've got the link to the blog site for that, the recording all her readings there in chat, this is a project she began in 2011. Based on this, her first book, Reading the World, Confessions of a Literary Explorer, was published to great critical acclaim in February 2015, and as you know, has led to invitations to all sorts of events on books and reading and on publishing, and the book was also published in the US as The World Between Two Covers. More recently, she's written 2 novels, the international bestseller Beside Myself and Crossing Over. Helen Vassallo is another expert reader, or an in-between reader, I suppose, as we've been encountering these figures over the past 2 days, readers who are also translators, who are authors, who are researchers. She's a senior lecturer in French in the University of Exeter, and her 2 primary areas of research are literature in translation and contemporary women's writing in French. Her project, the Translating Women Research Project, launched in 2018, brings together these interests in its focus on books written and translated by women, and has involved a blog with weekly book reviews, opinion posts, and guest writing. And as with Anne Morgan's project, you'll see that you've got the link to those projects in chat. And what I'd really like both of you to start with is to sort of basically tell us a little more about these projects. What inspired them? How did they develop? What impacts have they had? And I'll hand over to Anne and see where we go from there.
Thank you, Helena. Yeah, a year of reading the world. As you can tell, the name of the project is slightly wrong, because 10 years later, I'm still reading the world. And I've sort of made my peace in the last few years with it being a lifelong endeavour. Certainly wasn't what I envisaged when I started the project, purely naively for personal reasons, because I'd identified a massive blind spot in my own reading and realised I'd spent most of the first 3 decades of my life reading only Anglophone literature. And that seemed rather crazy. So I set off on this year-long endeavour to try and read a book from every UN-recognised nation in a year. But what happened very quickly was that the world got involved, and people all over the planet, book lovers, translators, writers, all got involved and helped me in different ways to achieve this goal, which turned out to be much more challenging, much more thought-provoking and much more illuminating than I initially realised, not only because of the challenges of getting literature in translation from a number of countries at that point in time, but also because of the insights that it gave me into reading, the way we read, why we read, what makes us want to read, and what makes us want to read literature from traditions that may be unfamiliar to us, and how might we go about doing that well. Now, lovely things have come out of that project, as Helena said, and continue to do so. And I'm very fortunate to have been involved in some fantastic projects and some fantastic events around the world. Some of the best things that I've been most pleased to hear about have been the fact that a number of the countries that during the year that I tried to read the world had no commercially available literature in English translation, the world's most published language, and therefore a huge powerhouse in terms of who gets heard, who gets read, and who has access to which audiences. A number of those countries now do have some form of literature in translation, in several cases because translators heard about gaps in those in that world library shelf through my project, and went off to seek out books that they could bring into English. A couple of examples include Beyond the Rice Fields by the Madagascan author Nevo, translated by Alison Sherratt, and also Jethro Suter's translation of The Ultimate Tragedy by Abdoulaye Sylla from Guinea-Bissau. Of course, one book is not enough to represent a whole nation's literature. It never can be, and that is another big problem and challenge, and something that I had to think carefully about, but it's a start at least. However, one of the most fascinating things that has happened for me is the interactions that I've had since that quest, which have been much deeper, more wide-ranging and thought-provoking than even everything that happened that year, and have really helped me to develop an understanding of some of the ways that books circulate and some of the things that stop us perhaps reading as well as we might. Interactions have included everything, and to be honest, I still get messages almost every day 10 years later from people somewhere in the world about this project, from everyone from a Mormon woman in the US frightened of reading books that contain references to sex, to an Afghan schoolboy wanting to get hold of international literature but not knowing how to do so in the absence of bookshops and online delivery where he was. And in fact, and I have to say I don't do this for most people, but when I did courier him some titles, he wrote to tell me that reading the New Amsterdam Books and Saki Books translation of Ismail Kadere's Broken April made him feel as though he was reading about his village, and he was astonished to find this literature from a very different part of the world, bringing up for him so many things that he recognized and made him inspired to write about his own village one day. Anyway, these interactions have given me a huge sense of what the world, what reading and cultural exchange has to offer, how books can connect us. And so now I keep the project going with occasional posts on issues connected, but mostly by Book of the Month reviews, where I feature one title a month. And in addition to hopefully highlighting books that some readers might not come across by other means, I hope that those reviews model an approach to reading that might be somewhat different to many of the reviewing practices we see, and help people to see how they might more profitably read from books from other traditions.
That's really, really fascinating, Anne. And particularly the way in which it went from being quite a personal project, coming from a personal need, to sort of quite an activist project, a sort of collective project. I'm quite interested to hear now from Helen, because my feeling would be that in some ways you came from the opposite direction, from already thinking of an activist project, but there's also had an impact on your kind of personal reading. But Helen, tell us all about your project, please.
Thanks, Helena. I mean, funnily enough, actually, I think my story might be more aligned with Anne's, that it started off as something more personal and has become something bigger than I ever expected. And it certainly has become, it's evolved in a way that I didn't expect at first, because the personal trigger for me was that I got to the end of 2017 and realised that I was stagnating in what I was reading. You know, I was just always reading the same authors, or, you know, if you like this author, you might like this author, and they were all kind of Anglophone if it was for pleasure, or perhaps French because, you know, I read a lot of French for work, and then sometimes I might find books written in French that I wanted to read as well. And I just felt that there was nothing new, and that I was reading the same things, and that this was somehow deficient. And in a way it was really, and for 2018, I made my New Year's resolution to read more widely. And so then I was given as a gift, a few days after that, in fact, The Vegetarian, which I meant to have with me as a prop. I was about to gesture with an empty hand, but anyway, The Vegetarian by Han Kang, translated by Deborah Smith. And I was given that book along with a subscription to Tilted Axis Press, which is the publishing house that Deborah set up that focuses on Asian literature in translation. And like probably most people, my knowledge of Asian literature was pretty poor, because it's not something that we read in our curriculum. It's not something that we're typically overexposed to. Is, you know, something I think we're going to perhaps discuss later on. And as a result of reading that one book in particular, reading The Vegetarian, I have this really clear memory of how it ended up linking to my research, because at the same point, a research project I was working on had come to an end, and I didn't really know what I was going to do next. And that's quite a rare thing in academia. I think you're always planning 6 projects ahead. And so I just was at this limbo state, I guess, both personally and in terms of my research. And so the moment that I remember really clearly was, I'm sorry if this is too personal, I was sitting reading in bed, and I just kind of put the book down and sighed and said to my husband, oh, I wish I could work on books like this. This is amazing. And he just turned to me and went, well, why can't you? And the penny dropped. Well, why can't I? Who says I have to carry on reading the same things that I've done, writing about the same things I've written about? And that basically was the start of it. Within a couple of months, I'd set up the blog, which I wasn't sure anyone would ever read. And I got myself a Twitter account, which I wasn't sure anyone would ever follow. And it all kind of did happen, really. And the focus has changed a lot. You know, as Anne was saying, what I thought it was going to be at the start isn't what it turned out to be. So at the beginning, I was interested in the idea of women writing women characters, and I quickly found that quite reductive. You know, so why should a woman have to write about being a woman, or about what it is to be a woman, or about her experience of womanhood? I realised, as I say, quite quickly, that wasn't where my interest lay, but far more in terms of how a book might get to publication, how it's received. So perhaps that network being just as important as the individual writer or text. So in terms of research, my approach is certainly much more agent focused now, thinking about the people involved in bringing a book to publication. But I still get to focus on texts with the regular reviews that I write on the blog. So I, you know, as you said, I review mostly weekly and fortnightly if my schedule doesn't quite permit a weekly review. And I think, you know, because I'm not committed to reading something from every country in the same way that Anne was, I don't necessarily have the same difficulties in terms of sourcing what I read. But I do find, and something that I try to work on and need to constantly work on, is to make sure that there's diversity within what I read. So obviously reading in translation, I think, automatically carries with it a diversification of reading. but then within that, very quickly, we can slip into quite narrow categories. So that's something that I'm keen to challenge in my own reading and in the way that I work with the project. And in terms of kind of how it's evolved beyond me, I think the greatest impact has been becoming part of a reading community. And it's just so wonderful and supportive. You know, people are always saying how terrible social media is. And because all I do is book Twitter, I've got no other experience of social media than that. I find it brilliant and really supportive and wonderful, and a great place to share ideas. And it's fostered some wonderful relationships with other readers, with translators, with publishers, with authors. And to think that that all stems from, you know, sighing over a book one January evening in 2018 still never ceases to amaze me.
And both of those accounts are so inspirational in many ways, because, you know, because I'm sure there are many of us on the call right now who are passionate readers, who are passionate about sort of reading diverse books and so on, but then taking that step of actually sharing our readings and sharing our voices and our views of these books with the world out there is kind of it seems like such a major challenge, you know. So I just kind of, before we move on to the next big question that we've got planned, I just wanted to honor the effort of reading these books and then sharing your readings with them, but wanted if you got to know if you've got any insights into sort of how quickly you can learn to become an expert reviewer, or a reviewer that's able to share their experience of reading in such open and hospitable ways.
Well, I suppose I mean, I studied English literature, and I had done some book reviewing prior to the blog, and was very comfortable writing about literature in academic terms. So I suppose I had that background. But I think, and something I'll hopefully talk about a bit later, is really what I feel I'm an expert in is in not being an expert. Really, the whole premise of my blog is about curiosity. It's about discovering I didn't know something and setting out to see what I could do about that. And to this day, I still approach it in that spirit. So, and actually I found that people respond most warmly when you are open about what you don't know, and when you don't try to presume to understand everything. So I think that can be a strength.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I find sometimes that I haven't particularly connected with a book, and so I'm never going to say this was a bad book because I didn't feel that connection to it. I will always try and say, well, why didn't I connect with that, and why might somebody else and not me? Or, you know, basically always be aware that my review is only my opinion, however considered that opinion might be. And I think something that I find really important as a reader is humility, and the ability to just accept, as Anne just said, that you don't know everything, and that's okay. You know, just because I've read a couple of novels from Japan doesn't mean I know Japanese literature, and I'm okay with that. I'm really glad that I've read a couple, probably more than a couple by this stage. But not being an expert, I think Anne phrased it brilliantly. It's, you know, not being afraid to not know is really important. And I think that's hard for those of us who come from an academic background, where if we don't know something, it's perceived as a weakness that people can pick up on. And then, you know, you're always trying to show that actually you have thought of that. And one of the things I found really liberating about the blog is I don't have to put page references and I don't have to do footnotes. I can just write from my own feelings, from my own place, and connect with people more in that way. And I think because there's that human aspect, and this is perhaps a slight digression, but I mentioned humility then, and in the work that I've been doing, because obviously the personal and the research focus really come together for me in the project. In the work I've been doing, it's starting to occur to me more and more that one of the qualities that I think makes a brilliant translator is humility, and that awareness that of the responsibility that they have, the massive task that they have, accepting that sometimes this word might not be the best one, even though, you know, I've often talked to translators and they said it went to print and that word bugged me for ages, and just knowing that, and instead of trying to say, no, I was right because it's what I chose. And I really like that aspect, you know, the awareness that we don't all have to have all the answers all the time, and that things are constantly shifting as well, and what feels right, you know, at one point might not be right at another. So I'm sorry that was a bit of a digression from your original question, Helena, but it's actually something I've been thinking about a lot.
Well, I kind of, if Helena doesn't mind, I kind of wanted to pick up on what you said, Helen, and maybe move something that I was planning to say a bit later, but seems to fit naturally here, which is developing that idea of not knowing. You talk about the pressure in the world of academia, but I think actually as readers, certainly in many Anglophone countries, we're sort of inculcated from quite a young age with this idea that reading should be about wringing meaning from a text and understanding it completely. And for me, that is exemplified by comprehension exercises, which many of us may have done in school, where you're presented with an extract of text and you'll ask questions about it. What does this word mean? Can you rephrase this sentence? What's going on here? And I'm sure there are many useful skills that pupils learn doing that. However, the implication is that if you can't explain everything, you're failing. And as you said, Helen, ignorance is not something any of us likes to admit. So we tend to repress that, I think. And so that ignorance, or when we encounter something in a text that we don't know, the tendency is to feel this knee-jerk reaction of irritation, or this isn't for me, or this text is flawed or bad in some way. And you still see that in some reviews, actually, where the reviewer clearly has been annoyed with the text and has decided that there's something broken in it, something flawed, and judged it on how closely it or how far away it is from the golden standard of the Western novel. And I think actually that not knowing is so important. It's something that I'm hoping to develop. I'm thinking about this idea at the moment of developing incomprehension exercises, and I haven't yet quite worked out how to do that, or who might be the best person to best organisation to partner with for it. I mean, I welcome any ideas, but
yeah, do you know what I love about this? There's a kind of, I suppose there's a critic who you'd see as being completely the opposite end of the spectrum would be someone like Harold Bloom, but he has this thing. One of his books is a map of misreading. So you'd be kind of like, you'd be providing a space for misreadings, basically, and do you know?
Yeah, well, a space for misreading, or a space for, I think, particularly drawing people's attention to those moments where they have those knee-jerk reactions and get cross with the text, or irritated or frustrated, and then interrogate that. Well, why is that? Where's that coming from? And what opportunities are there, both for learning about things beyond this text, but also for learning about their own conditioning and their own reading, how they read and how they might change that. So I think there's a real opportunity there for getting comfortable with discomfort and not knowing. So that's something that I'm very interested to pursue.
Yeah. This is so illuminating, the way in which you're talking about the reading process, and the reading process opening it up as a space of encounter and kind of allowing yourself to be sort of vulnerable and open in your encounter with sort of other texts and other worlds and other ways of looking at the world. But I'm very conscious that we're in a conference that's about reading and translation, and about all of the different agents involved in sort of the process of a text moving from one location to another and being received by other readers, and you yourselves are part of that process. And I was just wondering, what have your projects revealed to you about kind of the role of the publishing market in what's translated and what isn't translated, the impact on translation, the accessibility to other literatures, texts and voices?
Well, I think I've certainly found out a lot more about how books get into our hands. And for me, the biggest revelation is just how Eurocentric still a lot of translated literature is. And I keep coming up time and again against this sort of cult of the familiar. And that's, I think, one of the problems with approaching translations is that automatically people might assume that it's going to be hard, or they're not going to connect with it somehow because it's different from their own experience. And already then you're putting a barrier up and, you know, not not embracing that openness of moving towards understanding, not expecting a text necessarily to come to you, but taking a step towards the text. And that's one of the reasons why I so appreciate the risk-taking independent publishers, because often books that make it through from less familiar cultures, they might have gone through a packaging process in their country of origin. So they might be prize-winning books, and of course, you know, it's well documented that those books will be far more likely to be male-authored. If it's a question of which books have received funding from cultural institutes, for example, to get translated and exported, then they might be deliberately chosen for the way that they represent their culture abroad. So perhaps works that are more critical of particular regimes might not make it through as easily. Tiffany Tsao has written a really interesting piece on Indonesian literature and how Indonesians are actually erased from Indonesian literature in the way it's exported. So if anyone should want to read further on that, it's available in Electric Lit magazine. But we might also be only receiving books that don't destabilize Western readers too much, that give us just enough of what's familiar. And if I can just mention another reference there, recently Jeremy Tiang wrote about this, and I think brilliant. Yes, Helen was putting the links up there. Thanks so much. Just this idea of we want to read in translation, but we still want it to be recognizable to us. And one of the things, you know, to bring it back to Anne's project and her reviews, one of Anne's reviews that I absolutely loved, and it was about a book that we both loved, which was Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor, translated by Sophie Hughes and published by Fitzcarraldo early last year. And Anne described it as a book that does not come meekly to the reader. And I keep that phrase in my head, you know, nearly a year and a half later, because I think that's exactly what we should want literature to be. Literature should challenge us. It should make us question our assumptions. It should destabilize, make us aware of what we don't know, to go back to another thing Anne said. And I think ultimately, literature should make us feel something.
Thank you, Helen. That's lovely. I love the fact that I had no memory of that quote, so it's lovely to hear it. Yes, I think much of what I have to say is very similar to Helen. I would say what I often think of is the genreification of national literatures. Something that bothers me, and it's a problem with my blog as well, is using nationality as a classification tool for literature. And in publishing, that often means that we end up with these Western constructions of what a nation's literature is. So the literature that makes it through is not actually an accurate representation of the breadth of what is written and enjoyed in that country, but rather literature that is like a breakout bestseller. So Haruki Murakami is a great example. And in fact, there was a brilliant tweet at the start of this year showing a number of book covers of Japanese novels in translation, all of them referencing the Japanese flag with the circle in the design. And when you saw them all lined up together, it was quite astonishing, actually. And that real signaling of this is Japanese literature. And so if you've read Murakami, you'll also like this. And what it means is that publishers look for books that are similar to those successes, much as they do in other areas of literature. But when it comes to national literature, that means that the reader has this idea that, oh, I know what Japanese literature is. It's like Haruki Murakami. Well, of course, Haruki Murakami is a Japanese author, but there are plenty of other writers writing very differently in Japan. And I think in some cases, the chances of those other voices making it through to us are diminished by this sort of grip onto what this notion of Japanese literature or another nation's literature is, which is essentially constructed by the Western publishing industry.
I completely agree with that. The idea that if you've read one particular author, then that is somehow representing the literature of that country. Because apart from anything else, I really object to the idea that any author should be yoked to this moral imperative of representing their country. You know, just in the same way that a woman shouldn't have to represent what it is to be a woman, why should, you know, a person from Indonesia or China or Norway or wherever else just have to represent what life is like there or what the literature of that country is? You know, I think if you ask me to define English literature, you know, I grew up in this country, but I don't know if I could tell you what it is. And I've read a lot of work originally written in English. Yeah. So you know, I think we shouldn't expect literature to represent its country. We shouldn't assume that we know the literature of a country because we've read one book or two books or three authors or whatever. We should constantly be on this journey of learning. And I think, you know, it happens, you mentioned Murakami there. I think it also happens with Latin American literature, that there's this assumption that everyone's still doing magical realism. And it's lazy, it's stereotyped, and we need to kind of push through those, because if that's the way things are marketed, then it's not going to help with the dispelling of those myths, is it? So I think also you asked earlier, Helena, about reviews, and I was thinking about this while Anne was speaking, and about what we've discussed in terms of humility. I know when we chatted a few weeks ago, we talked about a review that I particularly disliked, that was very critical of a book that I loved, but that's not the reason I disliked it, because I think we're all allowed our opinions, and as long as you can say why you felt a certain way, then I don't think any reaction is wrong. But the reviewer started out by basically belittling the author by showing his own knowledge of everything else that came from that culture, you know, all this literature and film, and how this person doesn't measure up somehow to all these greats that have gone before. And so I think that was a real lack of humility in that review, which bothered me much more than the fact that the reviewer hadn't liked the book as much as I did, because I think it just showed that there was an expectation that, look, I'm saying what I know about literature from this country, and this doesn't quite fit. And why is that? Why should that be a bad thing?
So this is back to that idea of genreification. I can see that in the chat there's quite a lot of people who are feeling your pain there on this, and certainly Jessie Kirkwood's mentioned this insistence on mentioning Tokyo in on every cover that refers to that's for a book that's that originated in Japan and so on. And certainly yesterday we were having we heard about the kind of the pigeonholing of contemporary Russian literature, you know, that it has to have something to do with sort of corruption and so on, you know, before it's going to be marketed and by the big publishers, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it feeds into a problem that I see sometimes with readers who are eager to broaden their reading and want to branch out. And what you'll often hear when people start to say this is and think about this is that they want books that are authentic or that capture the spirit of a place. And it comes from an earnest desire to engage with what the world may have to offer and to learn about different traditions and different cultures. But of course, when you unpack that idea, it's problematic, because what will feel authentic to such a reader will really be just a sort of hall of mirrors reflection of their own preconceptions, of images that have been beamed at them by the Western media and bits and bobs that have been picked up. So rather than actually a voyage of discovery, people who go out in search of authenticity can often find themselves sort of really just stuck in their own little hall of mirrors, and feeling that they're moving forward. And the publishing industry risks, I think the big publishers, certainly the small presses, as Helen said, are doing a heroic job of countering this, but the big publishers who have such power and control and reach in terms of what people see, pander to this and risk stoking that. I think it's a real problem.
And just on that, I mean, given that we, I suppose that certainly having gone through the whole sort of COVID experience and being in lockdown and having all the bookshops closing for such a long period, and yet knowing that when you go on into the online world, that you're often sort of going straight into exactly that, a hall of mirrors. You're being shown what, you know, often what an algorithm has constructed as your behaviors and your likes and so on, and that's what's coming back to you. So how do you find your way out of that? What's the way out of the hall of mirrors?
Well, I mean, for me, back in 2011, 2012, it was asking for help. Now, I don't know if that would work. I don't know nowadays, with the internet as it is, whether that sort of project would be possible in quite the same way, because I think that reach and that freedom has been curtailed in the intervening decades. But there are wonderful resources out there, wonderful websites such as Words Without Borders, the English Pen World Literature Map, which are great places to start. I also think that following your inclinations can be a useful thing. So if there's a particular, reading widely doesn't mean you have to throw everything out and just completely throw yourself into the unknown. If you like a particular genre, if you like sci-fi, why not go and see what Haitian sci-fi is like? If you like crime fiction, go and see what it's like in different countries around the world. You might find, as I did with South American crime fiction, that it's actually rather different. Use those things as sort of ropes to pull yourself out of that slough slowly. I think that can be a really good way of going.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would also add that changing the way we think about our own internal algorithms is a good place to start, because we tend to look for books by author. So we read an author that we like, and then we go and read everything else they've written. And often, that reading model isn't going to work if you're reading in translation, because especially if it's contemporary literature that you're reading, it's not a given that an individual writer will have a body of work to discover. So rather than thinking, I liked that novel from, I've got Haiti in my head now because of what Anne just said there, but so I'll go and read more from that place. Why not think, I liked this novel that publisher produced, so I'll go and see what else they've got? Because especially if it was published by a small independent press, small publishers, they have really strong identities. So I'm thinking of publishers like Charco Press, for example, who publish, okay, there's a geographical focus there as well, Latin America. But Latin America is a big place. There's a lot of countries there. And even if you tried to scratch the surface of one of those countries, you wouldn't do it in a handful of books. So, you like this book that they publish, well, go and see what else they've got in their catalogue, because they have to build their brand around a certain reputation, around a certain identity. And so the chances are that if you like something, they're going to publish more things that you like. So Fitzcarraldo Editions do some brilliant, publish brilliant works from all around Europe, for example, or Comma Press and their Reading the City series. So again, if what you want is to discover a place, that's a brilliant place to start, because these are books written about particular places, but not necessarily in a way you'd expect, very embedded in their culture, but also exposing very universal feelings, emotions, responses, and situations. And then, and other stories as well are great for just knowing what you're getting when you get one of their books. And a lot of these publishers have subscription models. I mentioned Tilted Axis earlier. A subscription to Tilted Axis was a real turning point for me. So I think, you come to recognize a book as belonging to a particular publisher. You can say, oh, that's very much their kind of book. So why not think, instead of I liked this author, how about I liked this publisher? I don't think we're trained necessarily to look at who published a book. We're trained to look at who wrote it, and we're starting to train ourselves to look at who might have translated it. But I think it's also important to look at who published it.
I was going to say that actually translators can be a useful way of discovery. If you've particularly enjoyed a novel and you've noted the name of the translator, it can sometimes be worth seeing what else they've translated, because often there are certain translators whose names on a project will make me feel confident that it's going to be a really good project. So that can be a great way as well to broaden out.
It's that both of those answers are really interesting, and especially they seem to, as far as I'm concerned, there was a question in chat asking if it's possible to read against the trend of publishers' set ideas of national literature, and how in many ways both of the answers that you've given there are kind of taking us in that direction, looking at the smaller independent publishers, and looking at what translators bring to the particular translators take to the table. Is there anything else that you'd want to add in there for Sarah as ways of reading against this trend of publishers' set ideas of national literature? I mean, I suppose the other thing is to start activist blogs like yourselves, really.
Well, book Twitter. I often pick up books by eavesdropping on other people's conversations on Twitter, you know, that people are talking about. There are a lot of other bloggers and other people in the book industry who have very interesting things to say and act as sort of scouts, really, if you watch on Twitter. So that can be a useful way too. But I think it's actually, you become more adept at finding your own path through it, I think, and it works best when it fits with your personality and your style of browsing. So what works for me and the way that I find books may not always be the best fit for someone else. The individuality of it is part of the magic, I think.
I guess the only thing I would add is just read more, you know, because by reading more widely than what's immediately in front of you, by seeking these things out, then first of all, you are resisting that narrative. And secondly, you're creating a demand. And, you know, market logistics show that if there's a demand, then supply will follow. So the more we ask for diversity of representation, the more we're likely to get it. So I think each of us have a small role to play there in terms of what we seek out. And I think word of mouth, which Anne mentioned implicitly there when she talked about conversations on Twitter, you can't underestimate word of mouth. You know, books can be made these days by word of mouth on social media. And so if you like to book, talk about it, you know, whether it's just to one friend or a community, or on a blog, or in a tweet, or in a classroom, or in the pub now that we're allowed back in the, you know, wherever, just tell people, just, you know, make sure that if you liked something, people know about it.
There's a really long question come into the chat, so I'm going to just pause and read it out. So Martin Vega says, thank you very much for this conversation. This year, I've been privileged to be one of the judges of the International Dublin Literary Award. The winner will be announced this Thursday, so hold this page. And he says he had to read many novels in English and in English translation nominated by public libraries from all over the world. And it's been a fascinating journey, which has made him think more deeply about the important role of high-profile international prizes and awards in the dissemination and visibility of literature in translation. Do either of you have anything to say about this? And I mean, the reference to the role of libraries as well there is really important as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Libraries can be hugely important, particularly in parts of the world where access to books by other means is difficult. So I think, yeah, and librarians, I mean, the number of, there's a great group called Global Literature in Libraries, in the Global Literature in Libraries Initiative, which is mostly US based, but librarians trying to broaden their collections. And it's really great to see that work. Prizes, I have mixed feelings about prizes. And it sounds as though, from the question, as though there have been some back and forth on that in the judge's own mind. But I think there are some wonderful things, and there are some great books that achieve audiences by virtue of being longlisted or shortlisted, which is fantastic. And most books that win prizes are fabulous. This is not to take away from the success and the achievement of those books. However, it can have a skewing effect, and there can, in certain circumstances, be rewarding things that please the sort of middle ground, I suppose, and that conform to many of the assumptions that we've been talking about already. I did find in my quest that sometimes, particularly in the case of countries where I didn't have much to go on, a prize would be a useful signpost. If something had made a long list of a prize, it kind of gave me something to go on. So I think they can be useful signposts, and they definitely have a role to play. And it's really important that judges give the sort of thought that Martin Vega's clearly been giving to his role. So I'm really pleased to hear that.
I have mixed feelings about this, really, because on the one hand, particularly because of my focus on women writers, I think if you're looking for prizes as a marker of the literary value of a book, then there are already so many more obstacles that certain demographics have to overcome, not just women, but other kind of social characteristics that may or may not intersect with gender. So social class, background, disability, all of those sorts of things, I think you're not necessarily going to get a representative book from looking at prize winners. However, if we're talking about prizes for translated fiction, where hopefully there's a greater openness, although, you know, what's filtered through to us has already had to go through a number of filters and obstacles, I think, then certainly the big literary prizes like the International Booker Prize can be hugely beneficial in raising the profile of a book. And, you know, we've seen examples of that in the last few years, where they've really raised the profile not just of the writer, but of the literature from that country. I'm thinking about Olga Tokarczuk there, for example, or, you know, to go back to where I began with Deborah Smith's translation of The Vegetarian, you know, that really raised Deborah's profile as an agent, you know, not just as this anonymous person. I think because that's a prize that does split the award between the author and the translator. And, you know, getting on that long list, and particularly on the short list, does lead to a boost in sales. I've talked to publishers about this for my research, and they've all said, you know, yeah, it's really great when we can get that kind of recognition. So prize lists are a great place to start, I think, if we want to diversify our reading, but we mustn't think that they're the only way that we can find out about books, because they're always going to have passed through several stages of filtering and obstacles before they get to us. So they're a great place to start. I wouldn't say they're a great place to end. You know, you get your book a long list and then you don't go beyond that for the rest of the year. I'm not sure that that's necessarily reading diversely. But it's a really great place to start. And I think the panels are really taking diversity into account recently. And I hope that's something that's going to continue, not in a tokenistic way, but just in the sense of just changing the way we look at things. Because to go back to these themes of coming to the text and the humility of the reader, I think we need to change this big sweeping we, you know, we Anglophones of the world. You know, I'm being a bit flippant there, but we do have this colonial legacy and this tendency to, you know, look at the other and want to define it. And I think we need to drop that attitude that we've probably grown up with in our education and in our society. And these are probably big dreams, you know, they might be eliciting tired eye rolls on the part of the listeners, I don't know, but I do think that there are big things that need to do. We can start with the small things. We can start by changing our reading habits, but I think in changing our reading habits, we also need to be open to changing our perspectives generally.
I think a perspective that I would be interested to see change on that theme really is the rather binary idea we have about translation at the moment. I mean, obviously, in one sense, a book is either translated or not. Someone else has either written the words in it other than the original author or not. And yet actually the reading that I've come to over the years is that most books sit more on a spectrum. The idea that something is either translated or not is actually much more problematic when you start to think about it, because of the variety of Englishes in which many books are written and the variety of traditions. And essentially, storytelling is about translating experience from one group of people to another. And whether you're writing in one language as a fiction writer, you're thinking of which register to use. And there are plenty of writers who blend linguistic traditions these days. So writers like the Canadian Ethiopian author Ida Merriam, who she blends Amharic and English in her novel, or Shafaz Fatima Haider, who she uses Urdu and English to construct a sort of hybrid language. And so actually, I know that readers in other languages often get annoyed about the fact that we make such a deal of reading in translation in the English world, because in other cultures it's not viewed as this distinction in the same way. And I think there's work to do in challenging the way we think about the whole business, actually.
And challenging the way in which we think about the relationship between languages. But a lot of what you're talking about is suggesting that we're seeing major shifts happening already. I know I was going to say to Helen as well, you know, given the way in which this conversation has developed, going from these very sort of personal projects to projects that have opened up to kind of basically to processes of sharing stories and making it more possible to share stories. I mean, talking about a we from that perspective is very different from kind of assuming that you stand for everybody else on the planet. Can you see that? I suppose there was a really interesting question in the chat though, and it's a long one, and I'm hoping I can find it again because I've been having Zoom problems. So Alex Burb asks, is genre a problem? We read so much more fiction in the present day than we read poetry or drama, and the body of foreign literature translated into English is consequently dominated by novels. As someone who researches cosmopolitan reading habits in the 19th century, Alex says he sees a marked contrast here. Victorian readers were much more inclined to regard poetry, especially classical poetry, as the authentic literary embodiment of the spirit of a nation. So I suppose he's asking, is it because basically we're talking about novels?
I'm not sure it is what, because we're talking about novels. The lack of diversity.
We're going back to the question of literature being forced into this pigeonholed and the genreification of national literatures, I suppose.
Well, possibly. I think also our assumptions about autobiography, that if somebody's written a novel, it has to somehow be a personal experience. And I don't know, I must confess I'm not an expert on poetry, and I'm actually reading a collection of Indian poetry at the moment, and I do find it ramps up my humility, because I do sit there thinking I need to read this again because I'm not sure I've entirely understood it. So in that sense, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer this question. So I'll stop in a moment and see if Anne's got something more useful to say. But what I would say is that in my readings of poetry, I think I'm guilty of this, but I think there's an assumption that because often it's very condensed and very emotional, that there is autobiographical experience in there as well. And I think maybe that might be a bigger problem, that we assume that whatever is written is the author's experience. So I'm sorry that that's a little bit to the side of Alex's question. I'm not sure I can offer an adequate response, perhaps because I have my own prejudice and I love reading novels. I don't know. But maybe Anne's got something more helpful that she could say in response to that.
Well, I think, I mean, like Helen, I mostly do focus on novels and I suppose a bit of non-fiction, but mostly novels and short stories. But something I did very much discover during my original quest was that genre, in terms of that distinction between poetry, prose, drama, breaks down in some parts of the world. So there isn't actually, if publishers are looking for things that fit neatly in those brackets, works from certain parts of the world won't get a look in because they don't. So a transcript of a griot's performance, well, is that a play? Is that a poem? Is it a sort of novel? How do you present that? Or a number of the stories that I encountered from some of the Pacific Islands featured songs, featured poetry, would have quite different formats, would feature artwork as part of the story, or stage directions in one of the transcriptions that I saw, where an actor had gone and collected these stories and he'd included stage descriptions because the performance of the narrator was so key to how that story came across. And so this neat sort of breaking down, and it doesn't even exist in certain traditions in that way. And so that's going to be a roadblock if you have a publisher who is looking at these neat sort of distinctions. I think that is a problem as well.
And so I know we're coming very, very close to the hour now, and I'm very conscious of that. So I just thought I'd put out to the floor to see if anybody has any other questions that they want to ask. So please do just actually put your hand up. But otherwise, I mean, seeing as we've had this long discussion about how the process of reading and sharing stories can help to connect across cultural, geographical, political boundaries, I was wondering whether you could name one thing that you'd like to see happen in order to sort of help more people have access to reading outside of their comfort zone in the way you have both.
Well, I'm going to be cheeky and name two very quickly, if I may. One is that I moving beyond that genreification of national literature idea and that siloing of literatures into nation states, I think we do need to be more open to hyphenated identities, as Montserrat Guiboneau has called it, people writing across cultures, because that's where a lot of the most interesting storytelling is happening these days. And I would like to see the industry open up to that and not use nationality as such a key tool in trying to convince people to read a book. The other thing that I would like to encourage is looking at how we teach literature and reading in schools, and that idea of the comprehension exercise, reconfiguring how we encourage children to think about books. World Book Day is a great example of what I think is going wrong with how we do things with schools in this country. You know, we don't, not leaving aside the fact that in the UK and Ireland we don't even mark it on the same day as the rest of the world. In this country, we make it about children purely, whereas in many other countries, it's an intergenerational celebration of reading. And there's no real world in World Book Day in this country. It's about kids dressing up as their favourite character, which is 9.5 times out of 10 an English language character, sometimes even a Disney character. Yeah, I'll leave Helen time to say what she'd like to say as well.
Yeah, I feel your pain with that one. I think for me, I'd just like to dispel the myth that translated literature is hard. I think there's this notion that because it's unfamiliar, it's going to be tough going. And that's not the case. You know, a great story travels anywhere. And so I think we need to do more to promote, I was going to say the universality of literature and translation, but I don't think that's what I mean really, because I'm not trying to say that, you know, we're all the same, and I don't think we need to find something familiar, but I think it being unfamiliar isn't so hard, and it isn't hard just because it originated in a different culture and just because it was originally written in a different language. And I think there's a lot more work to be done on dismantling those preconceptions that I think, you know, to go back to one of Anne's points just then, I think are ingrained in us from a very young age in the curriculum. And, you know, I suppose a related issue in modern languages departments is that we're sort of trained to see translations as inferior, you know, that you shouldn't be reading them, you should only be reading in the original language. You know, I always encourage my students to read in both, because I think you can get so much from reading a translation alongside an original. But to go beyond the modern languages issue, if I only read books in languages that I'm familiar with, I would only be able to read this tiny proportion of the literature that's available to me. And so I think it's very narrowing and very limiting. And instead, we just need to have a greater openness, I think, and work a little bit harder on some of our kind of lazy ideas about what translated literature is.
You're muted, Helena.
Sorry about that. My Zoom is playing up. So what I was going to say, so maybe the word is hospitality, the hospitality of translated literature rather than the universality, maybe. I mean, to sort of make it this place where people can come together and with the kind of openness that you've both shown to us today in this session. I'm really conscious that my Zoom is falling apart again. So, you know, the main thing I want to say is thank you to you both for what's been a really, really enjoyable conversation, really informative conversation, and a really open and hospitable conversation, I hope. And I'd like to welcome people to sort of celebrate this conversation with me. And if any of you, if your Zoom is still working, please do feel free to switch your mics on and ask questions, because I'm getting a sense that I'm going to be thrown out any second now. So thank you very, very much to both of you. That was really wonderful to hear about your projects.
Thanks so much. And thanks to everybody for the comments that I've seen popping up as we've been talking. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Helena, for moderating a brilliant session, and thank you so much, Helen and Anne, for agreeing to take part today, and for such a brilliant discussion and some really great insights into your reading process, and kind of giving us so much food for thought. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have a kind of 15-minute break. Do we have 15? It is 15 minutes. We have 15